Hey everyone, I'm Peter.
And I'm Grace.
Thanks for joining us for a special episode of My GeneSIS as we process through everyday topics and personal experiences.
Welcome to My GeneSIS episode 11. It's
Woo-hoo!
really hard to believe that we've actually done this many at this point. I'm excited to share somebody very special with you all, my wonderful husband, Peter.
Hi, it's me, Peter. I am who she says.
As you can see, he's a little bit of a goofball, but we are goofy together. And just a little bit about him before we do our traditional get to know you questions. Peter is currently a graduate student in a clinical psychology program, and he is currently in his third of 5 years in order to earn his doctorate in psychology. He is also a marvelous house husband, which we have learned during the pandemic specifically, because he has been home doing classes online, and a really loving doggy daddy to our little fur baby Ruby. So before we dive in, we're going to go into our traditional get to know you questions, baby. And
baby.
I know. So get ready for some interesting icebreakers. You ready, babe?
I'm ready. Wow, so corny. Okay.
yes,
yes, I'm ready. Fire away.
I love you.
I love you.
What has been your favorite pastime during quarantine?
I think something I've enjoyed during quarantine that I don't normally get to do. This is totally going to show my hand. I've really enjoyed going back and watching either highlights or full games of sporting events from my childhood. So even today I was watching the Seahawks game from 2012 just because I wanted to.
Just because.
And it was really fun and I enjoy that. And I never have time to do that. But during COVID quarantine, I have time to watch more sports somehow, some way.
It's also because you're desperately waiting for real sports and current time to come back.
It is true. I need my fix one way or the other.
Well, I suppose it works.
Yeah.
And he's got a bunch on DVD too, folks. He's got all these games waiting
so many
to be watched.
Wonderful games to watch, yes.
Oh boy.
You can pause these.
I love it. So, and I feel like I've seen this now after being married to you and taking on your last name. But I'm curious, what is the worst misspelling of your name that you have ever seen? Because I've seen some really bad ones for my own self now, having the married name. But I'm curious what kinds of things you've seen.
Yeah. People spell Peter wrong all the time.
What?
It's crazy.
It's only 5 letters.
No, they get my first name right. Yes, the last name Tissell is how it's pronounced.
Have to be specific about that.
I've seen it mispronounced, misspelled so many different ways. One of the best was actually it happened to you.
You can't use my story. Oh, I guess you've seen it. It's fine.
Do you need to tell it?
No, you tell it.
I mean, it was a good introduction to our last name. Soon after getting married, you started getting spam mail with the last name Pissell, Pissell, instead of Pissell. That was pretty bad.
Yeah.
Over my lifetime, I have gotten Tisdale. Once we went to go see like the Nutcracker, and our ticket said Tinsel. I think that was just seasonal mistake. Yeah, it's been butchered. It's mostly pronunciation. Usually people can get the spelling, but pronunciation, it's tough. Yeah.
Oh gosh, I remember. I know this is turning it back to my own experience here, but the letters with Pissell on it is from our student loan agency, and I had to call them back and say, can I just have you change one thing? And it was so embarrassing because they were like, is that it? And I was like, yeah, just change the first letter. So,
Oh, it makes a difference.
What a story.
It really does.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my last question for you is, what is the book that has had the most significant impact on your life?
I will list one that is relevant to what we are talking about today. A book that has had a significant impact on my life and I have read multiple times is The New Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
I read that while in college. I was really interested in what it would look like to have a career in criminal justice, and so I took a college course on I think it was juvenile delinquency, and that book was brought up, and so I read that. And that really just changed my understanding of not just the criminal justice system, but the world. And it really helped it was kind of a catalyst for me in both just my personal and professional pursuits and how I see the world and what I value and kind of what I want to achieve. So, good book, New Jim Crow.
By Michelle Alexander.
Yes, Michelle Alexander.
Yeah, it's really good. I can't remember the first time I read it too, because I think I'd read it before we met as well. We wanted to just let you guys know that today we are going to be talking about race in America, and we wanted to answer a few questions and kind of set some ground rules and like framework as we talk about this between the two of us, because this is going to be very much a conversation. So why talk about race?
Well, yeah, we were talking about just different things that we could talk about on the podcast together, and just thinking about the current climate and kind of what's going on in America today with the Black Lives Matter movement and the death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and numerous other African Americans at the hands of law enforcement. We just felt it was very relevant to the current times, as well as just based off of our own personal stories, our interests, what we learned about in school, just kind of some of the things that we've had going on in our own life, conversations we've been having together over the years
about this, where other people get a chance to hear kind of our thoughts on this. And so we're excited, we're nervous, but we're also ready to kind of share those thoughts and to share where we stand and to share our hopes in being able to be better supports for marginalized and disenfranchised communities and groups of people in the future.
Yeah, and I like what you said earlier, the idea that, we've been having these conversations, that hopefully this podcast is a conversation. We don't want it to be, I guess, educational or preachy or anything like that. We just want to be able to share some of the thoughts we have, some of the things maybe we've learned, and also things we've experienced, and just how we understand race in America specifically.
And I think one of the other disclaimers that we'd like to make note of too before going ahead is we are unable to end racism and systemic oppression with just this one podcast. Like,
what?
This isn't a magical fix all.
What? I've been duped.
If only it were that easy, But I think we recognize that by having this conversation that it's important for us to be responsible in playing our part in this.
Absolutely.
And to really just start the ball rolling in having these conversations and taking them beyond our home and taking them beyond our relationship and also to the relationships around us.
Absolutely. And I guess maybe the last piece we want to touch on before we jump in here is we just really want to acknowledge that we are sharing from what we know and what we've experienced. And so all of this obviously is going to come through our racial and cultural lens. I guess the glasses we wear, right? If you wear glasses that are tinted blue, you're going to see everything or blue perspective, while someone else can look at the same thing, but if their glasses are tinted through an orange perspective, they're going to see the exact same thing differently. So we recognize that being white people in America, me being a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant,
and also being cisgender,
being straight, there are, with that, I have a certain perspective, and I recognize that that's not everyone's perspective.
Yeah.
And I know within my perspective and my experience, there are biases that I have, things that just that are implicit, things I don't realize that I'm doing, or things I don't realize that I think, associations that I might have that I don't know. And so I just ask for grace and patience, and just recognize that we're all learning together as we step into this.
Or even better, we're unlearning.
Ooh, okay.
We're unlearning those implicit biases.
One thing is, language is super important when we have this conversation. And I really like the idea of learning.
Yeah, me too.
That's really powerful, because there's a lot that we, in the cultural waters that we have swum in throughout our life, we have been taught things, whether directly through education or through conversations, or things we learn through music and media and the news, and those things aren't always true. And so it's important to have an open mind and being willing to unlearn some of those things that our brain thinks that's just the way it is, when in reality it's not the case.
Yeah. No, it's so good. And I just love you, and I love your heart. I'm so excited then to now kind of get a chance to share these things with friends and family and strangers, whoever you might be who's listening.
Yeah.
And we hope that as you take part in this conversation with us, that it would get you to reflect and to think and to explore more, and find ways for yourself to continue to learn and grow in these areas. And it's really uncomfortable. There's a lot of pain in this journey, and we're right there with you.
Yeah, growing pains are part of the process. All right, well, then let's hop into our first question. Race. When was one of the first times that you noticed that you were white?
I'm just thinking of how to articulate it, because I have like a pretty specific memory. So when I was 13, my mom and I went to India. And we went to Calcutta, India.
Okay.
On a missions trip.
Okay.
And at the time, it was my first time really leaving the country. And I think I realized that I was one of the only white people in a room for once. And that was definitely a weird feeling. And that's also something I wasn't really aware of at 13. Like, I wasn't consciously thinking about race and my racial identity and ethnic identity, but I knew that I was an outsider. I knew that I didn't look like everybody else. And I also recognized that I was being treated differently because everybody else didn't look like me. So I was given special privileges. Okay. I was given special nicknames by some of the Indian people that we interacted with. They called me princess and royalty, and they wanted me to come speak, a 13-year-old to come and speak in front of an entire school of kids. And I mean, I was in an orphanage, and all of the kids just wanted to come around you because, you know, you represent privilege and power and goodness. And so hopefully if they can interact with you, they can get touched by that. Like, they can access that somehow or find your favor. Yeah. And like I said, at the time at 13, these are not things I would have been thinking about, but these are things that I look back at and go, wow, like, what an incredible experience to have at such a young age, to be exposed to that and to be exposed to that feeling, because that's a consistent feeling that people of color have
Mm,
on a daily basis. I mean,
yeah.
yeah. So I think that was probably really the first time in my life where I really acknowledged that.
Mm.
What about you?
I don't, it's not like a visceral memory or anything like that. I
That's
think
okay.
one time, I think a time that sticks out to me where I recognized that I was white. Um, I don't know, it seems silly, but maybe it's not. When I was in elementary school, my younger sister had a friend through
Mhm,
school.
mhm,
And one day we went over to her house for some reason, and her family is from Ethiopia,
mhm,
um, Ethiopian immigrants, and it was an intergenerational home. Um, and I just remember being there and um, like the music I was hearing, the sights I was seeing, even like the smell of like what was cooking and everything.
mhm,
I remember that it being such a stark, like, oh, not everyone lives and acts like I do and like my family do. Like,
mhm,
there's something different here.
mhm,
And I feel almost out of sorts, like it caught me
mhm.
off guard. Um, and I think that was kind of a very early time in my life where I recognized that, like, oh, maybe not everyone lives the same as me or does things the way that I think is like quote unquote normal.
That's really cool that you can remember that, especially that far back, and at least have that sense of awareness, at that point
I couldn't put the language to it now, but
in
it was a moment where I felt
time.
like I was out of my comfort zone,
Yeah.
and I think that's why it sticks in my
I see a theme here.
mind. Healthy discomfort.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Your turn to answer first.
Oh, okay.
When was the first time that you really noticed your own biases?
When I was in high school, trying to graduate high school, go to college, I
Mm-hmm.
was really interested in law enforcement as a career option. And so for kind of like my senior graduation project, I did this whole report on what would it be like to be a police officer in Seattle Police Department. So I
Mm-hmm.
actually ended up doing a ride along through the Seattle Police Department. Um, and in order to do that, I wasn't able to do it at my local precinct, which I grew up in North Seattle. I had to go to South Seattle, and that was in the Rainier Valley. Um, and growing up, I learned to have certain views and expectations of that area.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who aren't from the Seattle area, the Rainier Valley is predominantly African American, predominantly people of color. Is lower SES, and basically the message that I got um, was that was the like the unsafe
Mm-hmm.
part of Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember being intimidated that the Seattle Police Department was like, "Yeah, you can ride along with us, but you're gonna do it at South Precinct." I was like, "What? Like, oh, can we do it in the North Precinct? I'm more comfortable there." Um, and so throughout that day, doing the ride along, um, I just I was very aware of my discomfort and the expectations I had, and repeatedly those expectations and those things that I thought were true or things that I thought to expect from the experience. It was vastly different, and so that was from that experience. I actually started to really question whether I actually wanted to be in law enforcement,
Hmm.
um, just because so many of my beliefs, my biases, just kind of the way I thought the world operated. It was so different once I actually stepped into that community, operated in that space, and got to learn. Um, yeah, it's a powerful experience.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I'm glad that we're where we are now, but it's so interesting to see how time just molds and shapes you, and the experiences that you go through lead you to where you're at now. And it's like you take a totally different direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about you? When's the time that you noticed your own biases?
Looking back now, I can see a lot, but I wish I could say that I saw it as early as you did. I want to say the first time that I feel like I was really confronted with my own biases was in college. And to me, that makes me really sad because I think I went through life with a white superiority complex, with a mindset that I'm great, I'm awesome, I'm kind, I'm a good person, therefore I'm loved, people like me, I don't have anything to worry about, I'm always nice to people. But that made it so easy to be totally ignorant of the fact that there were implicit biases that I was, probably inflicting microaggressions on people, and I wasn't even thinking about that.
So I want to stop you there because you dropped some major terminology for those people listening at home. The first term that you use, white superiority. Could you help us understand what you mean when you say I grew up with the perspective?
Yes, and this came mostly from the community that I was within. I would say white superiority can be seen as having this common knowledge or understanding that to be white, to physically have white skin or pale complexion, makes you therefore superior or better or more powerful, or greater than compared to somebody of a different skin pigmentation.
So in a society where white superiority is valued and enacted, somebody who is white would be seen as good, would be shown respect, would be shown deference as compared to people of color. Okay. And then you also mentioned implicit biases. I wonder if you could unpack that for us.
I guess, you probably have better terminology than I do.
I can go brain science. You want me to go brain science?
You go for it. You go for it.
Okay, so brain science. Here we go.
Blow their minds.
This is why I'm going to graduate school, so I can explain implicit biases. Okay, so the way the brain works is you've got all your neural pathways, right, that you use to remember things, and the simple principle is you use it or you lose it. So things that you think about and use often, tying your shoes, remembering your parents' birthdays, things like that you use often, you remember, and they become shortcuts that you think of faster and that you go to automatically. It's so your brain doesn't have to do as much work, so you can think and act quickly. Implicit biases are when the brain takes that shortcut, and that shortcut ends up making you believe and act on something that isn't necessarily true without you recognizing it. So in my experience, right, thinking about my ride along with the Seattle Police Department, I had been given messages in the community and culture that I lived in that Rainier Valley, South Seattle, is inherently more dangerous, crime-ridden, things like that. And so what did I do? I was inherently more guarded. I wasn't as engaging with the community members. I was, to a degree, more afraid to go to that part of town, right? I never said, well, I won't go there because X, Y, and Z. But my actions were dictated because I had those mental shortcuts going on in my brain, and I didn't realize I was reacting without thinking.
No, so good. And then the last one was microaggressions. And I guess when I think of microaggressions, it's those little things that you say or do that demonstrate basically racism in some way, in some manner. It's usually some almost short or snarky kind of comment, or it could even come in the form of a question. One of the things that I had seen recently was like somebody asking a person the question, like, what do your people think about this? So
Otherizing the person that you're talking to, using your language to say, clearly you're super different from me, and I'm going to lump you with all these other groups of people that are different from me, pushing you away.
Or you're pretty for a Black girl, you know,
backhanded compliment that implies.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. No, you're helping give it context, because for me, a lot of the ways that I learn is very much through like emotion and feeling and empathy. And so I've been working in a university setting. I am actively trying to inform myself on these issues so that, you know, when working with students and colleagues, that I am informed and that I am empathetic and aware of these things, because they do affect your relationship dynamic. But anyways, back to
that was a great rabbit hole.
Yeah, it was a great rabbit hole.
That's important.
The first time I noticed my own biases was when I took this, is it Stanford? There's some university that created an implicit biases test online.
Oh, is that the one where you press the
you press
X and Y buttons?
Yes, I don't remember which university.
I should know this because I've taken it multiple times. I can't remember.
I just remember getting it back and it telling me that I had implicit biases against a certain group of people. One that I had never thought of before, and a group of people that I haven't had much interaction with in my lifetime. And I was like, what? Like, that's total baloney.
And for some context of how that test works is it shows pictures, right, of people, and then words like good, bad, kind, angry. It puts out words with images, and you're supposed to press buttons on your keyboard as fast as you can to link the pattern that they tell you to follow. And based off your times, this is going back to brain science and implicit biases and the shortcuts we take growing up. We get messages about this type of person or these groups of people. This is the adjective that we put for that group. This is how we describe them. This is how we see them.
Yeah.
And so when that pairing comes up in the test, your mind goes quicker, right? So you respond faster, versus if you have to unlearn that pairing, it's going to take you longer to push the other button.
Yeah.
So it's brain science showing that the messages that you've learned growing up through society and culture about these stereotypes, about these racist, prejudicial views, they're hardwired in your brain, and you have to actively unlearn them.
And you have to actively almost act against them. Like you have to actually physically almost make yourself do something against what your brain is almost telling you that it should be.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the first time I can really think that I was made really uncomfortable and aware of my own bias.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very eye-opening. If we could actually remember what the test is,
we'll put a plug for it in the in the
description. Yeah, we could totally do that. Okay, so I think it's your turn. Next question.
All right, next question. Knock them out one by one. Grace, how often do you think about your race or your ethnicity? And I guess we should probably distinguish those two for everybody listening at home.
Yes, please. Well, I can tell you that race is a social construct created by people.
Your professors would be so proud of you right now.
So proud. Yes.
Race is not rooted in science. The science is very clear. There are no significant differences between races of people. It is simply skin pigmentation and phenotypal differences, which means differences in how you physically appear. There is no difference in intelligence, no difference in skill or aptitude. Humans are one species.
It was basically a racial hierarchy was designed many, many, many years ago in order to designate power to white people. and therefore oppress all other groups of people. And that was literally how race started.
Yes. Ethnicity is different.
Yeah.
Ethnicity refers more to the geographical, cultural context that you come from.
Mhm.
So for me, I describe myself as a fourth generation Swedish American who I am white, but my ethnicity is majority Swedish.
Mm.
Being Swedish is different than being German or
Yes, for sure.
Portuguese.
Yeah.
Although people from those countries may present as physically white,
Mhm.
the values, the belief systems, even the religion of what it means to come from a Swedish heritage generations, it's different
Yeah.
than if someone who's coming from a different part of the world, even a different part of Europe or Scandinavia, although we then fall under this racial label of white.
Mhm.
There's something distinct about your ethnic heritage.
Yes. So kind of going back then to the question.
What was the question?
How often do you think about your racial and ethnic identity?
Yes. Good question.
I think these days I'm more conscious about my racial identity, especially with right now I'm really in a process of trying to educate myself, and I've been doing a lot of reading and podcasting, and so I think I'm very aware of my racial identity right now in the context that I live within.
Mhm.
However, my ethnic identity, I have been and continue to feel ignorant of, and that is something that I am hoping to explore further so that I can find a more solid ethnic identity so that I can understand where the people that I come from came from, the things that they did, what defined them, and also see
Yeah.
how that informed where I am today.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that you recognize that you're in a process of educating yourself, and we recognize that this is a journey. There is no magical mountaintop where you're like, behold, I have learned all the things and I am all knowledgeable on race relations in the United States. Because that's just not the reality. And so it's important to enter this conversation, just this world of thought with just humility and patience and just a heart and willingness to want to learn and grow and be stretched and go through those growing pains. And so I really just commend you as you are going through that.
I mean, you get to go through it with me.
That's what marriage is about.
There you go. So Peter, then in response to the question you asked me earlier, how often do you think about your racial and ethnic identity?
Today, I think about it an awful lot just because of what is going on in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So part of my graduate school, for my practicum, when I practice being a psychologist, basically, I work at a Native American boarding school. And so I've done that for a year now, and I'm about to go back, hopefully, if COVID will cooperate.
COVID permits.
COVID permits. I'll be back again for a second year working at this high school for Native American and Indigenous teenagers. And so after doing that for a year through this process of, I grew up in Seattle. I've lived in Washington, Oregon my entire life. I've taken classes on Native Americans. I guess I've been passively exposed to the Native American community, playing reservation schools and baseball in high school and stuff like that. But I never had substantive knowledge, meaningful connection with Native Americans and Indigenous peoples. And so this process has really been a growing experience for me. A lot of what I do know about my own identity and kind of my ethnic heritage is because of my experience working with Native Americans, because I wanted to understand where I was coming from. And the more that you learn about Native Americans and their history and the relationship with white people in America and with the government and with the settlers and the colonizing of America, it made me very aware of that I wasn't just white or I wasn't just American. I came from somewhere, and my ancestors had a role in the oppression, the genocide, the assimilation of the Native American people. And so I wanted to learn that history so that I could better understand when I walk into that school and I work with those kids, something that is an aspect of Native American culture is that you are not an individual, you are not alone. There is a collective, there is a community, there is a connection between generations, a connection to ancestors. And so wherever you walk, they go with you. And so an image I've taken with me in my work is that when I walk into a room to be with a student, it's just not me and that student. It is my ancestors and it is their ancestors. And we are all together in that space in that moment. And so it's important for me to understand what was the relationship like between our ancestors, and how does that impact the interaction I'm having with that individual, even if I don't know why that student thinks about me a certain way, or I think or assume things about them, right? Those implicit biases we have, those come from somewhere. They come from our ancestors. And so I think about my racial identity as a white man. I think about my ethnicity as a Swede a lot, because Swedish Americans moved to the Yakima Valley for agriculture. The Yakima Valley is home to the Yakima Nation. And so it was important for me to recognize that I am not immune from the injustices of the past. It was important for me to recognize that my ancestors played a role in the suffering that I'm currently seeing played out in the lives of these teenagers.
Yeah, and actually that's a really great segue into our next question, which has to do with white guilt, because part of that experience of going into these relationships and understanding what our ancestors and the people before us did in the relationships with groups of people that were in conflict, or were oppressive and harmful, we in current day, like I myself, experience white guilt or white shame. And correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially my understanding of white guilt is this recognition that I myself or the people before me that I am connected to have done something wrong, and hurtful and harmful to people of color or to groups of people such as the Native American community. And so those feelings manifest themselves in anger and sadness and feeling like I'm a terrible person, like I'm white, so therefore I'm horrible, or I'm Swedish, so therefore I'm the worst, like, if you want to add on to that, you can.
I think when you begin to delve into these waters, to dip your toe into the pond of race and race relations in America, you very quickly are hit with an onslaught of information and perspectives that go against what you were taught in school, what you learned in movies and music and on the news, and what you believe.
Oh gosh, yeah.
A lot of those things that you thought this is just the way it is, you are exposed to different perspectives and a different reality. And so there is that feeling of guilt and shame. For me personally, the way I combat it is to further educate myself and then use those feelings, those emotions, while also recognizing kind of the power and privilege I have as a straight white male, and recognizing where in my life I can begin to provide reconciliation.
Yeah.
And so for me, I have found it to be very meaningful to be able to work at a Native American boarding school.
And I think along with you, the way that I manage my white guilt, oh my gosh, I mean, I can remember my first times being exposed to those feelings. And I was just so angry. And I just
Mm,
like, I honestly, it's horrible because I also know that there's more nuance to this. But I remember like bawling and being like, how could I have been a part of something so horrible? Or how could my ancestors been a part of something so terrible? Like to this day now, like I remember that. I wrote a lot about it. I did lots of
mhm.
journaling, lots of processing, but continued to learn. And I think as I continue to learn, um,
To unlearn.
yeah, well, educate myself on the history of these groups and of behavior of white people and the actions that we've taken over the years. I think those feelings have manifested then in this sense of understanding, like coming to this point where it's like, okay, I know that some bad stuff has happened, but I'm here because I want to learn or unlearn. I want to be able to do something to make a difference now, to change where we're at now by knowing the past. And I think that's really important is that we do know our history and that we know what's happened before us so that we
Mhm,
don't do it again. Because history does repeat itself. Those
mhm,
things do happen again if we don't stop them. And so
mhm.
um, I, in this, I recognize it's my responsibility to therefore stand against that cycle
Yeah.
and change it up.
Yeah, what I'm hearing as you share that is, I think it's called the 4 A's. I heard this somewhere on one of the 800 podcasts I listened to.
Of course.
The first A is awareness. You
Mm-hmm.
describe this feeling of shock, this emotional just explosion. It's a
Mm-hmm.
shock. It's because you're coming into awareness. This isn't something that we're taught about a lot. This isn't something that is told to young kids. It's something you have to go out and discover. And once you are aware of it, then I want to get these A's right. Acceptance. I
Mm.
want to say the second A is acceptance. And what you were talking about there is coming to this sense of like resolve and understanding of like
Mm-hmm.
this is the reality. This is what has taken place in this country
Mm-hmm.
to uh, racial and ethnic minorities, right? And I have played a role in it through microaggressions, through implicit biases. I accept that this is the reality,
Mm-hmm.
right? I've taken someone else's lens, that orange colored lens, and I'm putting it on. I'm taking off my blue lens. I'm putting on your orange lens. I'm seeing from your perspective, and I'm accepting
Mm-hmm.
this is what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third is analysis. Now that we know what is happening, what is our strategy going forward? And the last day is action. And so knowing you and knowing the way that you live your life and even the work that you do right now in higher education and your call and passion for social justice is you are constantly looking for ways that you can both analyze the place that you work and the people that you interact and how you can live into action those values of
Mm-hmm.
reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, okay, here's a goodie. Grace, what would you tell your past self when it comes to the topic of race?
I think I would want to tell myself that the times where things came easy, I think that there are reasons behind it that I didn't know and didn't understand.
Hmm.
I felt like throughout my life, I had opportunity. I had the favor of a lot of like people, usually people who had more power or authority. And part of that is because I was white and I didn't recognize that at all.
You got the
Um,
benefit of the doubt.
yeah, yeah, of course. And it didn't occur to me until, more recently that there are so many times where it was like I have been granted so much favor and I have been seen by other people with so much favor, and people pay more attention to me because they think that I'm exceptional. But that was partially because I was white. Sure, I did work hard, and sure,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, you're a hard worker.
all those things, but I think if it were to be a peer who was Latino or Black, and they worked equally as hard, I don't know that in those contexts that I had been in, if they would have been seen in the same way. And I don't think that they would have been treated the same way that I had been, which is, I think, hard to look back on and understand that. I think things are constantly changing, but it is interesting to think about what the world was like, only like 10 to 20 years ago.
What I'm hearing you talk about is white privilege. I think the image that's always come to my mind is the image of a race. And you did talk about, I worked hard, I know you have a really strong work ethic. You probably work harder than I do. At least in school you did, that's for sure. But even as you worked hard, there were things that you didn't have to go through. There were hurdles in the race. Other people were going over these hurdles, right? It was a 100-meter dash, and you had a straight track in front of you, while people to the left and right, who were Black, who were Latinx, they had these hurdles, they had these obstacles that were there, not because they didn't work as hard as you, not because they weren't as motivated. It was because there were things set in place through the education system, through the criminal justice system, through the healthcare system, through housing, obstacles that made it harder for them to reach the finish line.
So what I hear you saying,
ooh, I like that.
I know,
Keep
here
going.
we go, right? Is that there are larger things in place, or we could refer to it as systemic racism, could we not?
Yes, and that's awesome that you bring that up, because that's what I would tell my past self. We may have planned all of that. No, I think one of the biggest takeaways I have taken for myself over these past few years of learning about this topic, and even as we're thinking now about Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd, racism for so long has been viewed as one bad actor, right? The one bad apple, the one bad cop, the one dude in a KKK hood, an individual deliberately choosing to do something, say something that is racist towards a person of color. And while that does happen, while those individual moments happen, racism is bigger than that. I think of it as a giant machine. Our country, our society is a giant machine, and at the beginning, when they set the machine in motion and all the gears were turning, the people who built the machine were WASPs. They were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant cisgender males. Many of them owned slaves. They had views and values and beliefs, and whether they intended to or not, those values were put into the systems they created. So you see racism on a structural level in education, you see it in housing, you see it in criminal justice, you see it in healthcare, and I could talk forever about those things, but just for my past self, I would want my past self to know that there are these larger social systems in place, and they were designed either deliberately or unconsciously to favor me, a white man, straight white cisgender man, over people of color. And so women too. And over women as well, right? And so is in the same vein as I think about, well, I worked really hard and I was valedictorian and I did all these things. Like, yeah, I worked really hard, but there were a lot of hurdles that I didn't have to go through. I never had to deal with food insecurity. I didn't have to deal with issues with housing. I had access to crazy, awesome education, and that was tied to employment opportunities for my family. And I didn't have to worry. I could call the cops to my home, and I felt safe by them being there versus feeling threatened. All of those systems have worked in my benefit while they work either passively or actively against people of color. So what we're seeing right now with the Black Lives Matter movement is people coming to the realization that criminal justice and law enforcement is built on systemic racism. The first recorded establishment of law enforcement, I think, was slave catchers in the Carolinas. And so if you think about that as the origin of law enforcement in the United States, and you think about who are the types of people that end up in prison and the disparities between races and ethnicities in prison, you recognize that it's designed to target and oppress people of color. And what we're seeing specifically is that it's having horrible, disproportionate effects on the African American community. And we're having those conversations now, unfortunately, because of the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah. Wow. That was super sociological. I loved it. Also, a little note on the side of that, read the new Jim Crow, because that totally fits in with basically everything that Peter just covered.
I realize I never explained what the new Jim Crow is. It is a book written that describes the criminal justice system and how it was basically designed to replace Jim Crow laws that were in the South to segregate, suppress, discriminate against Black people, and how that has moved into the criminal justice system in a way that was written to appear colorblind, but in reality targets African Americans.
But before we totally wrap up, because we've taken some good time to just talk about this and cover as much as we feel is necessary today.
As much as we can.
We wanted to leave you all with some really wonderful resources that have impacted us specifically, because there are way more resources out there in the world on these subjects.
Yeah, we don't know them all, but we would love to share the ones that we have found and have been helpful for us as we unpack this topic.
Yeah, the new Jim Crow being one of them, and a reminder that is by Michelle Alexander.
Yes. So a lot of the things I'm going to recommend are things that are related to criminal justice, because that is a passion of mine, and that was kind of my coming into this conversation about race and racial relations in America. It was through the criminal justice system. So another book that I found wonderful to read was On the Run by Alice Goffman. She is a sociologist, and she wrote about what it was like, the African American experience in Philadelphia and the relationships that they had with law enforcement there. It's just a phenomenal book.
Wow.
Some other things that I've come across that have been really meaningful for me, if you're more of a visual person, there's a documentary on Netflix called 13th that also kind of talks about the criminal justice system working against African Americans. And then another thing on Netflix is a dramatization on the story of the exonerated Central Park Five called When They See Us. Phenomenal piece. It really highlights kind of those big social systems that we talked about and how they can actively work against African Americans and how they end up in the criminal justice system as a result.
Ooh, wow. And then there's so many more. Another one that's really visually appealing, it's a video and is also educational. I really like the Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man video series that can be found on YouTube. And it is very powerful to watch all these people come together and ask questions.
Yeah.
And you can tell these people on the show are genuinely seeking to make a change in their lives. And so I think that's really cool to hear these questions, especially since they're ones that we typically want to ask. And there's usually some really insightful answers in response.
Yeah.
Also, some really great podcasts.
Because
Because I do have some more books too. But podcasts. One of my favorites right now is called White Homework by Tori Williams Douglas. It is awesome. I absolutely love it. She basically uses this as an anti-racism platform where she brings in guests each week to talk about different aspects of race and basically things that she's encouraging white people to listen to. Like, she wants white people to hear about the Black experience.
Awesome.
So, and not even just Black experience. I mean, she's had LGBTQ, some really great representation, some really great insights.
Great way to learn.
Yeah, love it.
1619 podcast by the New York Times. Phenomenal. 1619 is the first recorded date of slavery in North America and the United States. And so it talks about how in the 400 years since 1619, the impact that slavery has had and how it has rippled through various aspects of society and the impact it's had on the African American community.
It's so powerful. And then I would also recommend Code Switch by NPR. This isn't specific necessarily to the Black experience, but it covers a lot of stuff just within different communities, but it also covers like politics, gender, history. It's just really insightful, and it shows you a lot of different perspectives about different groups and different parts of history. So I would really encourage you to take a listen.
Yeah, as we talk about taking off our own blue lens to try on orange lenses, purple lenses. Code Switch is a great podcast to hear the world from different perspectives and kind of challenge what you think is reality or what you think is quote unquote normal. It really just helps you grow in that respect.
I love it. And then I have 2 books then that I want to add here at the end, and Peter's read one of them and hasn't read the other yet.
I'm working on it.
But right now I am in the middle of How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. It's written so well, like it's a really easy read and really powerful because it's coming from a Black man who was raised in a very white context. And so it's really interesting too to hear him talk about his own biases towards the Black community as he was raised, because he was raised within such a white context. And so it's fascinating, and it's super powerful, and really it really resonates with today.
That's really good. Yeah, and the last one is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And that one's just a really great resource. I think that you can read it as your first stepping your toe into the water, or as someone with more experience and kind of information on this topic. Either way, it really helps kind of unpack what does it mean to be a white person, what is your role in understanding and engaging with conversations around race and race relations in America, and just kind of unpacking some of the defenses that are kind of built into whiteness. And it's definitely one of those books for the healthy growing pains.
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah. Oh man, there's a lot of shockers in there that you're like, whoa, where did that come from?
Yeah.
Took a little while to process that.
Yeah.
But anyways, again, thank you, Peter, for being a part of this conversation.
Yeah, this was a blast. I've been enjoying listening to your podcast, so I'm glad I got a chance to pop on here and just share some stuff with y'all.
And I just love your insight. I love the person that you have become and the things that you are learning and the things that you're doing in your life. And so this is a really great topic for us to cover, because it shapes a part of our immediate family and the values that we have together, and the values that we wish to share then with our future family as well. Yeah,
this is a really big part of our relationship and our story. So it was really nice getting to talk to you and to share it with all of you listeners. And I hope that it provided some benefit to you.
Yeah, so thanks for listening, and we hope that you decide to tune in with us next time. I'm sure Bex will be back, and we'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.